Greetings. My name is Kent Hill, and I'm the Senior Fellow for Eurasia, the Middle East, and Islam for the Religious Freedom Institute. And on behalf of the Religious Freedom Institute, I'm really delighted to welcome you to a special program today on the appearance of a very important new book. And the book is by Stephen Rasche, and it's entitled The Disappearing People: The Tragic Fate of Christians in the Middle East. It's being distributed by Simon & Schuster. You can get it from Amazon. We'll be with Steve a little later in the program when our Middle East director, Jeremy Barker, will interview Steve, and we'll have a dialogue with me. And before that, after some introductory comments from me, we're going to hear from some experts on the book and on some important questions related to the book. But let me say a little bit about the book first. I said it was a very important book. And the reason is because it tells the very sad story about what's happened the last couple of decades relative to the decline of Christians and other religious minorities in Iraq. And in fact, it takes place against the backdrop of over 100 years of decline of Christians in the Middle East. In fact, 100 years ago, there were probably 13.5% or so Christians in the Middle East. By 2010, it had dropped 10% to about 3.7%, and it's gone down quite a bit since then. Iraq is a particularly sad case. We've gone down from about 1.5 million 2 decades ago to perhaps 85-90% down from that to maybe 100 or 200,000 today. This book tells what it was like, what it is like to be among that disappearing people. And I want to tell you a little bit about the author because he's key here. He has lived and worked with the Iraqi Christians and Yazidis for quite some time. He was a corporate lawyer in Iraq in 2007, and he became friends with Archbishop Warda, the head of the Chaldean Catholics headquartered in Erbil in Kurdistan in northern Iraq. Steve's life was turned upside down when Archbishop Warda asked him to abandon what he was doing in law and instead help the Archdiocese have contacts with the public and private sources of potential support for Christians who had fled ISIS in 2014. And he abandoned what he was doing in law, and for these last 5 years or 6 years has been the contact person trying to get assistance to these folks. And so this is really very important. I had a note that, Christians have been in the Middle East since the day of Pentecost. And in fact, there were Christians who took refuge in Erbil during the Roman persecution. So it would be a real tragedy if indeed they disappear from this important land. Now, there's been a lot of debate about the assistance, and we're going to hear about that more later in the program. But I would say this: there are certain incontrovertible facts about what has happened. Number one, the decline has been steady and ongoing, and to the point now that, as I say, there was maybe 100,000, 150,000 left in Iraq. Number two, there have been serious problems and delays in the focus and the timing of aid to the Christians and other minorities in the Middle East, and particularly in Iraq. And third, there's another dimension to this, and I'm going to end my introductory comments with that. It is the fact that this is a national security matter. This isn't just a question of a niche interest of Christians about disappearing from Iraq. There's a fundamental national security matter in that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that when there are religious and ethnic minorities in a society, when there's genuine pluralism, that society is invariably a healthier, a more productive place. It's less dangerous to its neighbors than to its own citizens. And so the danger for America is to not pay sufficient attention to doing whatever is possible to keep minorities in a given society. So I'm hopeful that you will find this program both interesting and useful, and that it will enable you to help us be better advocates for religious and ethnic minorities all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East.
Hopefully the book which Steve has written will help people to understand the reality of our situation and how we arrive at this point in our history.
Steve Rasche has written a book which I believe to be extremely important for people to read, to understand what's happened to Christians in Iraq and Syria and in the Middle East. However, it's not an academic book at all. It's personal. That's what makes it so great.
The contribution that Stephen has made so enormously in this book will have to draw attention, international attention, not only to Christians, but also those who love humanity. So it's a wonderful tribute, and we do hope and encourage those who can to read it. And that when you read it, please don't doubt that you remain the same.
We are a people who are needed, not simply needy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Barker, Director of the Middle East Action Team for the Religious Freedom Institute. Glad that you've joined us for this event. The mission of the Religious Freedom Institute is to achieve a broad acceptance of religious liberty as a fundamental human right, as the cornerstone of a successful society and a source of national and international security. Joining me today is my colleague Kent Hill, Senior Fellow at RFI for Eurasia, the Middle East, and Islam, and Steve Rasche, author of a just-released book, The Disappearing People, The Tragic Fate of Christians in the Middle East. So Kent, Steve, I'm glad for you to join us for this discussion. I look forward to the conversation.
Glad to be here, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Good to be here, Jeremy.
So start just in setting the scene for this book that really is extremely important, not only for the story that it tells, Steve, but the perspective from which you tell it. And to kind of get into that, you open the book with this this quote that someone told you, a conversation you had in 2010 that went something like, well, you Americans have left us quite a mess here. Why don't you stay involved and help us fix it? So maybe to get us into the book, Steve, who said that, and how did that lead to you being in the midst of genocide a few years later?
Yeah, so that was Archbishop Bashar Warda, and for anybody who's ever met the Archbishop, it will not come as a surprise to you that he would speak that way. What had happened was I was working in the Middle East on a purely commercial basis. Going back to 2007, I was working on various infrastructure projects and some joint venture projects there. And by 2010, those projects, the economic purpose for them had been essentially finished. And so I was there winding up all of our operations. And at that time in 2010, the Archbishop had just been made Archbishop there in Erbil. And I had established pretty serious contacts, pretty numerous contacts within the Christian community during the 3-4 years that I'd been there. And just as a courtesy on the way out of town, I went and introduced myself through intermediaries, got a meeting with the Archbishop. And I went in, I met him and introduced myself and said, I'm on my way out. Is there anything that I can do to help your people? Because I know that they are in need. And his response is, as you said, well, you Americans have made quite a mess. You could stay and be part of the people that help us clean it up. And the underlying impetus for that from him was that at that time they already had over 3,000 families of displaced Christians who had fled north from Baghdad because of the all of the violence that had been taking place against Christians down there in Baghdad and Basra and other places in the south. So these people had come north, but they had no jobs. They had really no places to live, and they were in need of real help. And the Archbishop had the foresight to see, look, if these Christians are going to come here, we have to provide a means for them to have meaningful lives. Otherwise, we're just going to be a way station on their way out of the country. So with that as backdrop, I said, well, yes, I will do what I can to try to help you out. And so that began a period of time of 4 years in which I helped him out with feasibility studies, universities, hospitals, different types of things that they could do to help provide anchor institutions to keep the people there. So that's how I met the Archbishop. It was just like that. I walked in the door, said hello, and he said, great, can I put you to work? And that's kind of how he is.
It is, and I think Kent and I both felt a few of those types of assignments during our time with him over these last few years. So to kind of run through from 2010, and then the book really picks up in the end of 2014, and during that timeline, you have kind of these projects that you were involved with, trying to help slow the tide of people leaving the country. But then the situation in Iraq really changes in June of 2010 when Mosul falls. A few weeks later, the main Christian villages on the Nineveh Plain are attacked by ISIS. Early August, you have the attack on Mount Sinjar, the Yazidi community. And it's in that context that this book really picks up the story. And I think it was December of 2010 where you returned back to Iraq, not so much as an outsider, but a part of the community itself. And that's something I really appreciate in this book, is you're not really so much telling your own story as an outsider, but trying to give a voice to the people themselves. So who are some of the people whose voices you're trying to let speak through this book?
Yeah, so what happened, it was December of 2014, and when I came back, and that was at the request of the Archbishop and the other people in the Christian community, and that really was a turning point for me. Up until that point, I'd been traveling back and forth and all around the world, and in my work, but I would circuit through the Middle East from time to time. But it was all the work with the Archdiocese. It was all on a pro bono basis, and as I could fit it in with other things. And in 2014, that all changed radically. They asked if I could come over. The Archbishop encouraged me to come over, and so I did just after Christmas. ISIS had overrun Nineveh and Mosul that summer and into the fall. And so arriving there just after Christmas, Ankawa, Erbil was a city of refugees. Every vacant building was filled. Every partially constructed building was filled with displaced people. And people may not realize it, but in Iraq, in the north, especially there, it gets cold in the wintertime. It snows there. And so these people were living in half-finished shells of big residential and commercial buildings with home compartments separated by blue tarps that had been strung up by lines. And those are the conditions that thousands and thousands of families were living in. And so when I arrived there, the Archbishop had said, okay, here's our new line of work. You can see everything that needs to be done. Will you really stay and help us this time? And I tell people I'd like to say I just said yes, but I didn't. I looked at it and I said, this is really probably beyond me. But to do anything, to make any difference in it. But we spoke for a long time, and after some discernment and speaking with other people that I valued in the U.S., we decided to go ahead and do it. And so I stayed, and we began to work. And then through all of this, I arrived there as a lawyer, being able to have the bag of skill sets that lawyers have, ability to put projects together and figure out how to fund things and organize things and that sort of thing, and deal with foreign governments and institutions and all of those sorts of things. But the range of work that needed to be done was everything: food, shelter, medicine, pastoral care, you name it. It was everything. So it was everybody. It was all hands on deck all the time. And so we learned to do a lot of different things. And as part of that, we worked side by side right in there with all the people, with the priests, with the sisters, with the lay people, most importantly, the displaced people themselves. And we saw the entire mix, where the people who were displaced. It was all cuts of society. There were people who were quite well off, who lived in beautiful homes out there in Nineveh. I mean, beautiful homes by any Western standard, beautiful homes that lost everything. At the same time, there were poor people, who lost everything. And they all got washed up into Erbil, into northern Iraq, all the same. And they all had the same situation. It was a great leveler. And so I think, in terms of the people whose stories we want to tell the stories of what it was like for these folks having to deal with this, and on top of everything else, having to deal with the reality that they live in a country where they're persecuted. They're systematically and systemically persecuted for decades and decades and decades and centuries. And the cumulative effect of that is that they'd been ground down to this remnant population that had just been brutalized. And they have a story to tell, and this is what we try to get across in the book.
Yeah, I think that comes through very, very well. And as you describe that, you really do such a great job of speaking as part of the community. And I think I had some of this experience, Kent, as well, of working in humanitarian work during that time, coming in and kind of doing projects, but that's such a different perspective than being embedded in this community that hasn't just suffered one acute incident of violence and persecution, but this generational grinding down, as you just described. So within that, the book and the stories that you tell are at times inspiring in the work that's being done, and at other times really just heart-wrenching. What are one or two of the stories that stand out to you as you look back at this book and during the work that you were involved in during that time that stand out that people need to understand what it was like over those years to keep hope alive?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the things that were positive, or the things that were really most necessary, and I just touched on this a little bit just earlier, was the need for people to maintain some semblance of human dignity.
Yeah.
And not just being kept alive, as animals or something. You give them food, give them water, give them a place. They're human beings. And when they've in a situation like this, where they've already been robbed, brutally robbed of everything they owned their whole lives, with the exception of their physical being, their physical and family beings, but outside of that, everything else, their communities, their churches, their jobs, their homes, all of that taken overnight, and it robs them of their dignity. They just all of a sudden they're beggars. They're wards of somebody else. They're living on the street. They're deprived of even the basic things that make people human. And this was a difficult thing to get people to understand, people in the West, to get them to understand, look, if there's going to be any hope for these people to stay here, we have to give them lives that at least approaches dignity, and we would get such offhand, answers from some of the people that we would try to talk to about in the West, and we'd say, look, these Christians will all leave. There won't be any left here if we can't engage ourselves in a way that gives them some hope. They need, and as part of that, they need to have some dignity. We can't tell, a mother of 5, you get a hot shower once every 8 weeks. Who lives in that? And they don't, and they will go. They will go. And so we had to really fight with that, to get people to understand we need to put them at least in a place of basic human dignity, so that you could then deal with the more substantive issues of how do you stabilize and rebuild and get the people to stay. But I think that was, we did have some success with that, and because we saw it, and thankfully there were a number of private aid organizations that were able to work with us quickly on that without having us go through submitting, long-term plans and process evaluations and all of these things. We said, look, we have a camp here. For instance, we had one refugee camp. It had, probably about 1,200 people or something in there. And the people were on the verge of rioting. There were 5 communal toilets for 1,200 people. They had to line up every morning, for half an hour to go use the bathroom. People can't live like this. And what we did was we went out and found donors who would take care of these things. And they provided the funding. We said, this is what we're going to do. And we were able to solve those problems, get those people moved out of those places in a matter of weeks. And it saved those populations. And so those were things that were really heartening to us. We found that, if we could just get to the right people whose hearts were in the right place, who understood that humanitarian aid meant really engaging in charity, meant really engaging in mercy, and not just simply engaging in a process where you could turn around and say to your donors, look, we protected your money. We don't know what happened to the people. It looks like we failed, but we protected your money, and those people and those donors proved to be of really little value. And as we talk about in the book, unfortunately, that seems to be the main paradigm of the international aid community right now, which is make sure we pay attention to the process. And what we found time and time again was by the time they got around to solving the problems, it was too late. The people who solved the problems were the people who were really willing to get in and say, okay, what's the result we want to get? And can you do it now? Here's what you need, and go. And those programs work. We saved towns, we saved, thousands and thousands of families. And that gave us real heart that there were solutions out there, so that there were solutions that could be found.
Yeah, I think that distinction of people versus process, and Kent, that's something be great for you to weigh in on from your experience, having been in a number of roles in the relief and development space throughout your career.
Right. The thing I would say is I spent almost 8 years working for USAID, and then I worked for World Vision. And as a matter of fact, I was still working for World Vision when ISIS attacked Mosul. And I made my first trip to Erbil was in 2014 with ISIS about 25 miles away from Erbil, and it not being certain whether they would be able, the Peshmerga of the Kurdistan would be able to stop them from coming in. So we weren't sure even what's going to happen. But when you think about the plight of these Christian and Yazidi IDPs, and Jeremy, you know this from working in Dahuk with the Yazidis approximately the same time as well, You first got the trauma of what happened to them in the summer of 2014. They saw friends and relatives who were either killed or threatened with death. They left within minutes of ISIS storming into the Nineveh plain. They ran, they walked, they took cars, anything they could do, but probably walked mainly to Erbil. So they've got in their mind that the trauma of what they've been through. And then if you're stuck with being in Erbil trying to help, like Steve was, and like the Archbishop Warda was, yes, you care about their dignity, but you're also trying to figure out how in the world to find their next meal, find them a place to stay. And so you feel like you're going to everybody you can think of, private and public, trying to get assistance. And this is what Steve did for 5 or 6 years. He would go to Europe. He would go to the United States. He would talk to people about the concrete needs. He would try to make sure that the funds would come in. And in the midst of all this, it would just drag on day after day after day. And the planes would fill up in Erbil and sometimes fly off to San Diego or Detroit or someplace else. And they were just bleeding out of Iraq. And so it's that experience of that. I mean, we've been complaining for several weeks and months now about the COVID-19 crisis, and we're complaining about being stuck at home with our food and our family, and no real physical threat to us at all for the most part. It's just inconvenience. For these poor people, the refugees and the IDPs, et cetera, they don't know what the future is at all. And this is what I think I like about the book so much, is that you get to feel with these people of faith what they felt, not knowing what the future would be, not knowing if they could go back to the Nineveh plain. And as you may recall, Iranian colonists were moving into the Nineveh plain, in some cases into their homes, not allowing them to go back. The security situation was bad. So the issue is, what can we do about these kinds of situations? We have more refugees in the world right now than at any time since World War II. And many of them are religiously, religious refugees who are the victims of violence and persecution. So this is the world in which we live, and we've got to do a better job of figuring out how to help those who are stuck in harm's way.
Yeah, I think that is so true, that the assistance development actors, if it exists to do anything, it ought to be to help people in the midst of genocide. And that has to be more than just the food, water, and shelter. Those are basic essentials. But Steve, as you described, people are more than that, and the trauma that comes from having not only material goods taken away, but that sense of hopelessness about what's next, how you build a future. That's just is stripped away. Kent mentioned a little bit about the work that you were doing, not just in Iraq, but in the US and Europe, trying to marshal resources from private donors, from government donors. That's a part of the book that comes through as well. There's certainly a lot of failures we can point to. Before we maybe come to some of those obstacles, what are some of the successes from the 4 or 5 years of pounding the pavement, flying from capital to capital, trying to push for the needed resources?
Yeah, I think you need to just split them into two different paths. One is the path where we went for private aid from private aid donors, which had one level of success, and the other one is where we advocated and worked for aid and assistance from governments and institutional aid, such as the UN. On the government side of things, I think clearly the Genocide Declaration that was put forward and signed under the Obama administration by Secretary Kerry was a success in the sense of bringing the matter to the attention of people. And that was really a success that came about primarily from a grassroots effort by a number of really courageous advocates on the behalf of persecuted Christians and persecuted religious minorities in the U.S. that worked really hard. I don't think that anybody believes that the administration at that time was initially inclined to reach a finding of genocide, but it was really the hard work of a lot of advocates. Knights of Columbus sent a research team over. The current Assistant Secretary of State, Bob Destro, wrote the brief for the Secretary of State on why the Christians should be included in that genocide. And he did that during the time he was still a professor at the Catholic University of America. So there were a number of people that all came together for that. People within Congress, Congressman Fortenberry, and other groups, Nina Shea from the Hudson Institute, all came together to work hard for that genocide declaration. And so it finally came. And that was the good thing. The difficulty of it was it came, and then there was no real implementation mechanism for it to make an immediate difference on the ground. And we talk about that in the book, and I think it is one of the main lessons and areas of further analysis that needs to take place. What happened in Iraq and the genocide declaration that went right, and what happened that went wrong, in that it was not able to be implemented the way that people maybe had hoped at first. The second thing is the passage of HR 390, the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief Act. That was a bipartisan bill from Chris Smith on the Republican side and Anna Eshoo on the Democrat side. Of course, we would all like to see more of that bipartisan solution making to important things. But that was a great success as well, and we hope that will really help us in things to come along. In the last year, we've seen some real sea changes in the way aid finally comes about through USAID and through State Department, and things that are focused more clearly on results, in timely results, and getting those methods of assistance into the hands of people who actually are able to get them done, get things done, rather than just putting more money into the foreign aid machine just to spin it around and spit it out again. So all those things were positive things. So there are some good things that we saw in the area of government. Again, I spoke about this earlier in terms of civil society. There were a number of groups that came and helped that were able to move things along real quickly because of the way they did that. One thing I should mention also on the government side, the government of Hungary. The government of Hungary has their ongoing disputes within the European Union, and I don't mean to get into any of that. All I can say is that in the case of Iraq, the behavior, the action, the courage of the government of Hungary in trusting the local people, in solving the problems, in moving quickly, their behavior, their courage was singular amongst every other country on earth. They were there first. And I don't care what anybody wants to say about it. This is a fact. It happened. The people who were there know it. And whatever else the other issues may be, the government of Hungary deserves tremendous credit for how they worked, at least in terms of stepping forward to save these towns and these displaced people. It made a difference. It really did. And it is a model that absolutely worked.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a few things throughout there that really matter of really engaging and trusting the people themselves, providing resources that are flexible, that are there quickly, that allowed, I mean, Kent and I just a few months ago were back in Telescope, a town that more or less was saved because resources came in at the time that they did, and they enabled the people to do the work to revive their own community. And that's can't be overstated how valuable that is. To contrast this and these stories you go into more detail in the book in describing, what were some of the key obstacles or pushbacks that you were running up against as you were trying to get resources to come as I mean, ISIS and what had happened in Iraq and Syria was on the front pages of every newspaper, and it wasn't really a visibility issue so much as an execution issue. What were kind of the main challenges that you were facing?
Well, the fundamental one, and we still face it, is that for the recipients of institutional aid, of the global aid paradigm, I got to spend a lot of time over these last 5 years comparing notes with the recipients all around the world. I made a number of very good friends, for instance, in Africa, where many people in the church are dealing with the same thing. And the stories are the same. And that's the global humanitarian aid paradigm is broken. It's a model that is not working. And yet the people who are inside of it insist that it does work and that it is working. And you know, so you have two different viewpoints of this. You have one side, which is the donor and the implementer side of things, primarily from the West. And they have a paradigm that is completely process driven, and that's their mantra. It's process, process, process. On the other hand, you have the people who are supposed to be benefiting from this, and they just look at this paradigm and see that this is the biggest disaster, the most easily corrupted thing, most ineffective thing. It just skews behavior away from desirable ends far more often than not. And that is the biggest thing. I would sit in the offices and people would say, look at this report. You know, we'd go to visit with folks from the UN or AID early on, different places, and they would say, well, our reports are that the work is really coming along well, and we have these great reports, and look at this. And I would look at these reports and I'd say, well, with all due respect, I was in that town 6 days ago, and this report is just utterly false. You know, you're talking about having recovered this town for the Christians. There are no Christians there. You know, there are no Christians in this town where your report says there are. These Christians fled that town, and they're not coming back. And the work that you're doing to rebuild it in this historically Christian town, the people who are moving in there are not Christians. They're somebody else. And nobody wants to hear that. You know, they just say, well, that can't be true. I have a report. You know, and so the disconnect is so huge. And you know, this is not a thing that's unique to Iraq, but it is absolutely a thing that the West and the donor countries need to come to grips with. I know there are some groups, primarily within the UK, who are on board with this, the need for some real hard analysis on this as well. But in my experience, and I came into this with no axe to grind. Oh, I thought the UN, you know, we wanted to support them. We want them to do well. We want them to, you know, we want them to succeed in this. But, you know, as a lawyer, as somebody trained to observe facts and look at evidence, this is broken. And at the end of the day, it's not results we're talking about. They're human beings. They're human beings. The end product of humanitarian aid is its impact on a human being. And that is so lost in so much of the process-driven work that we see. And I just, I hope in some sense that this book can be at least some type of a catalyst for people thinking twice, donor countries thinking twice about, wait a minute, we thought, we were really contributing to a solution here. And are we really doing that with the way we're spending all of this money? It was a continuing discussion that we had with USAID, and Kent was part of many of these discussions. We would speak with them and say, it's not the amount of money you're spending. You're spending too much money, spending too much money. It's the way in which this money is being spent. It's the way in which this money is being spent. It's not reaching its end purpose. And as I said, thankfully, in these last 6 months or more, there really has been a sea change at AID, and we're starting to see some real good things there. But that's everything stems from that. Everything stems from that. It's a broken system.
Yeah, and Kent, in your foreword to the book, you bring out some really important lessons from this. What are some of those kind of key lessons that we need to be taking away from this?
Right. I do want to say this about the effectiveness of aid. I mean, one of the encouraging things I think is that when Steve presented some of the evidence that some of the UN reports were not accurate, in fact, were wildly exaggerated in terms of helping religious and ethnic minorities. And he took pictures behind the facade of a school, and it was in shambles inside, but the picture outside looked very good. When that was given to American authorities, to USAID, to the Vice President's office, et cetera, to members of Congress, it resulted in pressure being put on the UN to authenticate that, in fact, assistance was really going where the Americans wanted it to go, and they made the assistance conditional. So getting the evidence out is sometimes very important. It's not that USAID is perfect either, but there are a lot of good programs. There are a lot of programs that just aren't as well focused or not as quick as they might be. My concern there, and one of the lessons I would say needs to be learned, is there's been a kind of reluctance to trust faith-based organizations to administer assistance that can help themselves, that would actually give them jobs to recover a little bit, to rebuild their own homes and things like that. Sometimes there are mistaken ideas out there about whether it's okay for U.S. taxpayer dollars to go to religious organizations. Well, as a matter of fact, there's absolutely no reason it can't, within certain parameters. You can't use taxpayers' dollars to evangelize or do something for the church. You can certainly do it if it advances U.S. foreign policy and assistance objectives. So, for example, during PEPFAR, when I was working at USAID, we gave money to hundreds, even thousands of faith-based organizations who were partners in pushing back HIV. Randy Tift at USAID Today and something called the New Partners Initiative is doing some terrific job in sort of recapturing those lessons from the past and doing more of that. But you run into people from time to time who say, well, that's not even allowed. That's a violation of church-state relationship. Well, that's just absolutely false. So leadership needs to be very strong. One of the lessons, Jeremy, is leadership needs to be very strong in saying this is absolutely allowed within certain parameters. And not only is it allowed, we need the support of the faith-based groups. I mean, think of the Archbishop Warda in Erbil. For 5 years, he's feeding 100,000 people. He's got a demonstrated track record of doing it. But the money that came in to help do it was primarily private money. Knights of Columbus, Aid to the Church in Need. We didn't blow money directly into one of the most cost-effective programs you could have possibly done. We were uncomfortable with that. We need to get over that. But you asked about lessons learned. Let me give you several that we've got to do a better job at. Look, we may be down to 10 or 20% of the population, the Christian population in Iraq. That's no excuse now not to do everything in our power to help them to survive and to thrive in Erbil, at Baghdad, wherever they are. We have to make that a priority. Number two, we must remember the refugees who left Iraq and went to Jordan or went to Turkey or Lebanon. They're in no person's land there. They can't go on, they can't go back, and there's not nearly enough assistance to help them. So they need to be helped. And then I would mention one further thing, and I mentioned this in my introductory comments as well. The U.S. has to get a stronger handle on why this is in our national security best interest to prioritize helping religious and ethnic minorities. It's not just helping some minority group. This helps us. There's stability when minorities, Yazidis and Christians and other minorities are allowed to stay in these countries. And we don't move quickly. It's like it's a secondary or tertiary priority. It ought to be a top priority. We ought to take the kind of mechanisms like OFTA at USAID and use these mechanisms to move quick. We didn't move quickly to rebuild the houses on the Nineveh plain. Hungary moved very quickly. The US did not move quickly. If we'd moved quickly, we could have gotten Christians back there before they were colonized by Iranian militia. So if we had a higher priority for religious and ethnic minorities and it was focused assistance, we could do a better job. And I think that's one of the things we've learned from these last 5 years.
Yeah, I think so. There's lots more there that we've written about in the past, and I'm sure we'll continue to. Steve, just as we wrap up, there's maybe two separate fronts where I think you have maybe lessons to be learned or takeaways from this book. One is that I want to ask you about and get your feedback is the situation in Iraq itself for Christians, Yazidis, and others. What's the impact that you hope this book will have on that situation, those that are still involved, whether it's policymakers or those on the ground for the situation in Iraq?
Well, I think that, Iraq is on the brink of being a completely failed state. You have to be honest about that. There's no functioning government right now. And whether or not they will get one that the people actually can have faith in and begin to build upon is completely up in the air, to be determined. All of this is being pushed right now by the protest movement from the south, is primarily driven by young, disaffected Shia Muslims who have suffered under the corruption that has existed in Iraq since 2003. The end to this current government system, this corrupted government system, there's the opening for the Christians to remain as meaningful citizens, along with the Yazidis. And I think the young Shia Muslims, the young Iraqis have seen that this faction based power system suits nobody except the corrupt leaders at the top. And so there's that tension there now between the Iranian-backed power factions, which run the government in Iraq, the protesters who don't want any part of them. And the protesters are completely against these Iranian-backed power factions. Nobody should be confused about that. The amount of misinformation in the U.S. now about how the taking out of Soleimani and the pressure against these Iranian-backed militias has created a situation where the U.S. is now looked at as the evil party that everybody wants out. Well, that's just not true. It's just not true. I mean, there's a certain faction, the Iranian-backed faction, that wants them out, absolutely. But Iraq is just completely fractured in that. If they can get through this, if the protest movement can reach a point where they are able to push at least into existence a government which is somewhat responsive to the real concerns of the people, there's still a hope left for the Christians. As Archbishop Warda says, look, the Christians have survived And now it's their time to show the reason for them to be needed and not just needy. Okay, they survived. They survived ISIS. Still remnant populations of it and groups of it still exist. But the Christians, and some amount of them, 100,000 give or take, are still there. They're still there and willing to fight for their existence, not fight with weapons, but fight with their God-given abilities to show that they have a reason, that they have a value within the Iraqi fabric, that they're needed, that they're a needed element of society and not simply just needy people. And this is what the Archbishop is working so hard on, along with all the other people around him, is in the church as a whole in Iraq, even also from the Patriarch, from His Beatitude, Patriarch Sako. The Christians need to show that they are needed, not just needy. They're trying to turn this corner now. Yep. If the country doesn't blow up completely through a proxy war or the just collapse from this dysfunction in Baghdad, there's still a chance. There's still a chance. The Christians may be overwhelmed by circumstance. That's still a real thing. It may get to the point where there's just no matter what we do, they're overwhelmed by real open war or whatnot. And then the circumstances will change and we'll look to see what we can do. But for right now, the Christians are a people of hope. We plant our seed. We'll see how long it takes it to grow. Yep. And as I pointed out in the book, in one of the dark times, old priest told me, remember, Stephen, Christ only had 12 and everybody wanted to kill them too.
Yeah. Well, the one other message that I think you bring out so well is it's a story not just in Iraq, but it has implications elsewhere. As a final closing point, what's the message maybe you would give to, whether it's the situation in Nigeria and Bishop Kukah and that community and those working there? What's the impact you hope this book has for other situations and those involved in assisting there?
Yeah, I think this book was written for a Western audience. It's written to explain things to people in the West as to what the reality is like to be a persecuted minority and primarily a persecuted Christian. And so I think that in terms of the situation in Nigeria and the situation around the world, the important thing is to have the people from the West understand that there's a whole separate part of the world or parts of the world where, yes, in fact, Christians are lesser citizens and are brutally persecuted. And this happens systemically, and it's been going on for a long time. And it's a real thing. Now, Nigeria is a different situation from Iraq in the sense that they're not about to perish, as Bishop Kukah pointed out in his interview. There's still a large Christian population, but what he's facing right now in terms of the persecution, the violent persecution, and in fact, in some parts of the country, a real genocide, that this is real. This violence against Christians is a real thing. And for whatever reason, whether it's simply not fashionable, or it's something that is just a matter of the West not being properly educated on it. What we really hope will come from this book is that people will understand, look, the reality for these Christians and other religious minorities in so many of these countries around the world is really serious. And you need to pay attention to it, and you can't sugarcoat it. Whether it's political activists or students or people on social media, just by, hashtag, we are all this or we are all that. No, it's just way too easy. The West needs to educate itself about the people, all of the people who are really being harmed around the world, and you need to understand those things. I think it's incumbent, it's required of us in the West, if we're going to speak from these positions of assumed moral high ground on all of these things, we ought to know what we're talking about. And in the East, the Christians are being killed.
Yep, and your book does a phenomenal job of helping to tell that story. Kent, I'll turn it to you to any last words about this book as we bring this discussion to a close.
I think the prime virtue of the book is that it puts a face to statistics. I mean, our eyes kind of cloud over when we hear 85% of the Christians are gone or displaced, and somehow we can't figure out what to do with this. But a book like this puts a face on those statistics. And I think the last point I want to make is simply this. Despair is not a Christian virtue. And it is very easy to be overwhelmed with the problems in this world, the problems of religious minorities. And we're tempted to say, what can I do? I'm just one person. I can't do anything, etc. And it's like that old story of the little girl who is pulling out of the sea, off the seashore. What are those starfish, I guess? And an older person comes up and says, what are you doing? There are millions of those. You can't possibly save those starfish. And she says, well, I can save this one. And I think we need that attitude when we look at a problem like this. We need to ask ourselves, what can I do? What organization is doing something to help, make a contribution? What can I say to a congressman or a senator that would maybe make a difference, that they would focus specifically on this? And whenever we are tempted to be overwhelmed, we need to just take a step back and say, what is something I can do? A small step, a small thing, and then do it. Because there is always more that we can do, and there's plenty that needs to be done in a situation like this. And I'm grateful to Steve for having written this book and helped us to understand more clearly what the situation is in Iraq.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Kent, thank you for joining us for this conversation on the disappearing people. It's available for purchase now, so get that. To learn more about the Religious Freedom Institute and our work on challenging issues like this, visit us at www.rfi.org. So once again, Steve, Kent, thank you for joining me for this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the Religious Freedom Institute for hosting this event. We are grateful to remain in your thoughts during this difficult time for the whole world. In our situation, we have a situation of a pandemic coming on the top of a civil collapse, coming on the top of a genocide. And in all of this, we have real concern now that we will simply be forgotten. Hopefully the book which Steve has written will help people to understand the reality of our situation and how we arrive at this point in our history. What I would like the world to understand about the Christians who still remain in Iraq is that we are now a people with a clear mission. That mission is to demonstrate daily through our Christian service to all people of Iraq that we are a people who are needed, not simply needy. To demonstrate clearly that we Christians make Iraq a better place through schools and hospitals and other type of critical services, but also through who we are and how we live our lives devoted in service. As to those who seeks to assist persecuted communities, I would say several things. First, make sure you understand what the persecuted community sees as its own place in society, and do not try to impose what you think the place should be. In the case of the Christian, our historic role is in providing education and health care to all Iraqis. So when you think of helping us rebuild and stabilize, understand that these are areas where we can find anchors for our community and where assistance can truly help us. Second, I would say in general to all groups who seeks to help communities recovering or suffering from serious persecution, that there must be a sense of urgency in making sure this assistance comes when it's needed. Not many months or years later. So much of the aid we Christians and Yazidis have received in Iraq has come so late that by the time it has arrived, the problem has already moved on to some other areas. For the Christians of Iraq, this has resulted in some situations where by the time funds arrived to rebuild towns, many of our people had already gave up and fled the country and into the diaspora. And this is not because the funding was not there, but simply because the process of implementations was so slow. All of this points to a serious problem in the international aid system, which so often makes the process of greater importance than the people being served. Pope Francis has spoken strongly about this several times, reminding that the true aid and charity must put the needs of the people first. His Holiness is right to do this. And our experience in Iraq shows it clearly. I should note here that this problem does not exist just within the governments and the UN, but even within some faith-based donors as well. Third, as to a particular message to the US, I admit that the situation is complicated. On one hand, the US is involved in political tensions for the issue of the Christians and the Yazidis is only one part. We understand that there are many different priorities at this issue here. However, regardless of which path the US political and military involvement with the Iraqi and Kurdish government takes, we hope that the decision makers in Washington will still continue to accept some ongoing responsibility for the ultimate faith of the Yazidis and the Christians in Iraq. This is not simply a question of throwing a large amounts of money at the problem. In fact, we have continued to say that too much money is being spent. It is a question of providing help in ways that demonstrate that you are listening to us and not simply applying a poorly fitting process, attaching money to it, and then washing your hands of responsibility. Again, the Christians of Iraq want to be self-sustaining members of our society. We want to have the opportunity to live in a country where we are freely show that we are people who are needed, not needy. There is much that decision makers in Washington can be of help in this. whether they remain directly involved with the Iraqi and the Kurdish government or not. For the Christians and Yazidis, we hope and pray that this special moral obligation will remain. Thank you again, and God bless you all.
I'm Dr. Gregory Stanton. I am a professor of genocide studies and prevention, and I also am the founding president of Genocide Watch. Previously, I was also president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. I've been to Iraq many, many times. In fact, began going there in 2007, and have been back, for various reasons, including genocide education programs in Erbil. And during those trips, I got to meet Steve Rasche and Bishop Warda and all of the other people who make up that vibrant Christian community there. In fact, I celebrated Easter once in Archbishop Warda's church, and heard the Ave Maria sung in Aramaic. Let me tell you, that was one of the high points of my spiritual life. I'm a Christian, and I have had a very, very strong feeling of dismay and worry about the persecution of Christians in Iraq and in Syria, not only by ISIS, but also by people before that. And the fact that there were 1.5 million Christians in Iraq until just recently, when now there are only about 150,000 left, just saddens me enormously, because Christianity started there. That was where the first Christian churches were. And so Steve Rasche has written a book which I believe to be extremely important for people to read, to understand what's happened to Christians in Iraq and Syria and in the Middle East. His book, The Disappearing People, says it all. It's about the genocide of Christians and Yazidis and other groups in Iraq. However, it's not an academic book at all. It's personal. That's what makes it so great. His book is more than just a book about what has happened, because it's filled with compassion. It tells the stories of these people with a poet's penetrating power. And always running through this is the agony of his shared suffering with these people. He's been out there. He's slept on the Nineveh plain when it was under siege. Also shining through this book is the inspiration of a man who was called by God. Steve and Kent Hill asked me to talk a little bit about the efforts that Genocide Watch and other organizations, Nina Shea's Hudson Institute and Bob Destro's work from the Catholic University at the time. Of course, now he's Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. To get the Congress and then the State Department to finally recognize that this was genocide. This was not just some ordinary persecution, even though persecution is also, of course, a crime against humanity. This was actually genocide, the worst of all crimes against humanity. And we realized that there was a lot of resistance to that, because under the Genocide Convention, states that are parties to the convention have an obligation to try to prevent genocide. In fact, the World Court has held that. It found that Serbia had not tried to prevent genocide in Bosnia and found that that was a violation of the convention. So it's not just a academic exercise when we call something genocide. It actually has legal obligations attached to it. So what we did is we organized a thing called the Genocide Working Group. Bob and Nina and I, Scott Lloyd, several congressional staff and others organized this group, and we brought in a huge coalition that eventually, of course, got Congress to unanimously vote through a resolution saying what ISIS was doing was genocide against Christians, Yazidis, Shia Muslims, and other minority religious groups. So after that, of course, then Secretary Kerry at the State Department overrode the express desires of his legal department, which said not to use the word genocide. He overrode them, and he said, yes, this is genocide. It's obviously genocide. What we hoped would come out of that was a commitment by the United States to help those who had been victims of genocide, who'd been displaced from their homes. The entire Nineveh plain was just wiped clean of Christians by ISIS. And we had hoped, in fact, I've been there. I've been through some of the towns that they destroyed and where they drove all the people out. We hoped that through this declaration that there, out of it would come an enormous amount of aid to get these people resettled, and also security for them to safely return to their homes. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Even though a certain amount of money has been appropriated, very little of it has gotten through to the Christians. And there are various explanations for it, which Steve talks about in his book. I mean, there's been this bureaucratic confusion about what separation of church and state means, for instance. Separation of church and state doesn't mean that aid to a group that's had genocide committed against it, like the Christians in Iraq, can't receive aid directly through their churches. I mean, that's the organization that's out there. But these confused bureaucrats misinterpreted the, non-establishment clause in our Constitution to mean that they couldn't do that. They had to treat everybody equally, even if they were the genocidists themselves, which is, of course, nonsense. So that is one reason that the bureaucracy was not responsive. Also, they wanted to channel all of the aid through the United Nations, which itself was very heavily favoring Muslims, because the administrators of the UN in Iraq are Muslim. And that is why the Christians wouldn't go to the refugee camps, because they were discriminated against there, harassed there. It's why the church in Erbil especially, and also everywhere in Kurdistan and in Iraq, had to be the main assistant for these Christians who had been persecuted. So what Steve details is the difficulties in getting assistance through to these Christians. But I think a lot can also be learned from his book about the practical reasons why the world is so reluctant to respond with force to genocide, because that is the only way that you're going to stop a genocide. It has to be with force. And that pacifist tendency in the peace groups, in the human rights groups, and so forth, has really hamstrung our ability to protect people. And that is what's happened to the Christians. A lot of these towns now out in the Nineveh Plain and elsewhere are not safe yet for Christians to go back to. Part of it is that the Shia militias are moving in on land and houses and everything else in these places and taking them over. And the Shia government in Iraq supports that. So behind the scenes, you've got a really continuing persecution. Steve writes about all of that in such a persuasive way that I hope people will sit up and take action. I hope that out of this book will come a program to really help in very practical ways, and through the church, the people, the Christians who've been persecuted in Iraq.
Stephen has written a most fascinating book entitled Disappearing People, and it's a wonderful service that he has offered to humanity, and not just the Christian community in Iraq. Although the book itself was written at the instance of the church, this wonderful service tells the heroic stories of Christians as they faced, fled, and also tried to confront persecution. This is just one of the many documents that has continued to highlight the situation of Christians around the world. But it's a fascinating story because, as I said, it tells the story of really what our faith has always represented. The kind of situation that you would never imagine would be existent in the 21st century, because one would have associated these persecutions with the reality of the history of Christianity around the world. But as I said, what is most fascinating about the book is, one, that these stories have been recorded; two, that the great people of Iraq have continued to be courageous under fire. But of course, I think for us as Christians, there's the common saying that the blood of martyrs is the seed of Christians. I am happy that the book itself talks about disappearing people, which means they have not really totally disappeared. We can only hope that as this story makes its round around the world, the people who have fled Iraq, that by the grace of God, they will still come back to their country they love so much. We pray that the seeds that are still blooming, despite the difficulties, growing among thorns as it were, that through the instrumentality of the Holy Spirit, God doesn't abandon His church. And we believe that the contribution that Stephen has made so enormously in this book will help to draw attention, international attention, not only to Christians, but also those who love humanity. So it's a wonderful tribute, and we do hope and encourage those who can to read it, and that when you read it, please don't doubt that you remain the same. Thank you very much, and God bless you. Well, I think the similarity between Stephen's book and the situation in Nigeria, namely the story of the Christian persecution in Iraq and what we have in Nigeria, they're slightly different, in part because the Christian community in Nigeria is such a huge community. It's not an insignificant community. It's only in parts of northern Nigeria where the Christian population, in contrast to the Muslim population, is not sufficiently huge. But otherwise, the persecution that Christians have faced have largely been more administrative than physical. In the last few years, of course, things have gotten progressively worse, with direct physical attack at church structures and Christians directly. However, I think that our situation, as I said, bolstered by the population, also the intellectual and the physical and the presence of Christians in public service is sufficiently significant. So the two stories are basically almost the same, to the extent that we're talking about a growing culture of hatred against the body of Christ. But the Nigerian situation, as I said, is quite different, in the sense that we have a significant percentage of Christians in Nigeria. Nationally, we're talking of almost a 50-50 percentage of Christians. So, but there's two stories called for human solidarity, global solidarity, and solidarity within the body of Christ, for all of us to continue to carry this wonderful legacy that Jesus Christ Himself has left for us, for the transformation of humanity.